Good morning, everyone. This is your weather update for Wednesday, January 29th, 2025. And we are tracking a significant weather event that is currently impacting southwest England with heavy rainfall and an escalating flooding threat that has prompted the Met Office to issue multiple weather warnings across the region. Storm Chandra, the third named storm of this winter season, is delivering exactly what forecasters predicted: a substantial pulse of moisture streaming in from the Atlantic, colliding with saturated ground conditions that have left the region particularly vulnerable to rapid water accumulation and localised flooding scenarios that are developing as we speak. Let's break down what's happening right now across southwest England, because the situation is evolving hour by hour, and understanding the specific timing, rainfall totals, and geographic distribution of these impacts is absolutely critical for anyone living in or travelling through the affected areas. The Met Office has issued a yellow warning for rain covering extensive portions of Devon, Cornwall, Somerset, and parts of Dorset, valid from early this morning through Thursday evening, with particular emphasis on the 24-hour period we're currently in, where rainfall accumulations are expected to reach significant thresholds that could trigger flooding responses across multiple river catchments and urban drainage systems that are already operating near capacity. Current observations from weather stations across the region are painting a picture of persistent, heavy rainfall that began intensifying overnight and has continued through the early morning hours. Plymouth recorded 18 millimetres of rain in just the past 3 hours, while Exeter has measured 22 millimetres during that same time frame. And these numbers are climbing steadily as the core of Storm Chandra's associated frontal system continues to move across the peninsula. The rain we're seeing isn't the brief, intense downpour variety that moves through quickly. This is sustained, moderate to heavy precipitation that just keeps coming, hour after hour, and it's that relentless accumulation pattern that creates the most problematic flooding scenarios, because the ground simply cannot absorb moisture at the rate it's falling. Now, let's talk about what's driving this system, because understanding the meteorological mechanism helps explain why this particular storm is producing such significant rainfall totals. Storm Chandra originated as a low-pressure system that developed over the Atlantic, intensifying as it approached the UK and tapping into a robust moisture feed from subtropical origins. We're talking about atmospheric river characteristics here, which means an elongated corridor of concentrated water vapour being transported in the lower atmosphere and then being forced to release that moisture as the air mass encounters the topography of southwest England. When you have moist air being lifted over the elevated terrain of Dartmoor, Exmoor and the Cornish uplands, you get enhanced rainfall on the windward slopes, which is exactly what we're observing with some of the highest rainfall totals being reported from those elevated locations. The rainfall forecast through Thursday evening is showing widespread accumulations of 25 to 40 millimetres across most of southwest England. But here's where it gets particularly concerning. Over higher ground, particularly across Dartmoor and Exmoor, we're looking at rainfall totals potentially reaching 60 to 80 millimetres, with localised spots possibly exceeding 100 millimetres, where the orographic enhancement is most pronounced. To put that in perspective, 80 millimetres is more than half of what this region typically receives for the entire month of January, and we're talking about that falling in roughly a 36-hour window. That kind of rainfall rate overwhelms drainage systems, saturates soil to the point where additional water simply runs off rather than percolating down, and drives rapid rises in river levels that can transition from normal flows to flood stage in a matter of hours. The Environment Agency is currently monitoring river levels closely across the region, and as of 8 a.m. this morning, there are already multiple flood alerts in effect, which means flooding is possible and people should be prepared. Specific rivers of concern include the River Exe, the River Tamar, the River Dart, and numerous smaller tributaries that respond very quickly to heavy rainfall due to their steep catchment characteristics. The River Exe at Exeter has risen approximately 1.2 metres in the past 12 hours and is currently flowing at elevated levels that are approaching the threshold, where we start seeing water encroaching onto low-lying areas adjacent to the river channel. The prediction models are showing continued rises through this afternoon and into tonight, with peak levels expected sometime between midnight tonight and early Thursday morning, depending on exactly how the rainfall timing plays out. For those of you in Devon, particularly in and around Exeter, Tiverton and areas along the River Exe and its tributaries, you need to be aware that flooding impacts are likely to develop through the day today and into tonight. We're talking about potential flooding of low-lying land, roads, and agricultural fields that sit in the floodplain. If you live in an area that has flooded before, if your property is in a known flood risk zone, now is the time to be taking preparatory actions, moving valuable items to higher floors, ensuring you have a plan for how you would evacuate if needed, or making sure your mobile phone is charged and you have a way to receive emergency alerts. The Environment Agency provides a free flood warning service that you can sign up for that will send you direct alerts if flooding is expected in your specific area. If you haven't already registered for that service, I would encourage you to do so because having that direct warning can provide critical extra time to protect your property and ensure your safety. Cornwall is also seeing significant rainfall accumulations, particularly across the northern coast where onshore flow is driving persistent precipitation. Bude recorded 16 millimetres in the past 3 hours. Newquay has measured 14 millimetres, and those totals are going to continue climbing through the day. The particular concern in Cornwall relates to the combination of heavy rain with saturated ground conditions from previous rainfall events. We've had a wetter than average start to January across much of the UK, and Cornwall has been no exception, meaning the ground's capacity to absorb additional moisture is significantly reduced compared to what it would be if we were coming into this storm with drier antecedent conditions. That saturation means surface runoff happens more quickly, streams and rivers respond more rapidly, and the threshold for flooding is effectively lowered, because there's no buffer capacity in the soil to moderate the rainfall to runoff conversion. Somerset is facing its own set of challenges with this storm system, because the Somerset levels, that low-lying region that's particularly prone to flooding, is already seeing water levels rising across the drainage network. The combination of heavy rainfall in the upstream catchments, tidal influences from the Bristol Channel that can impede drainage during high tide periods, and the generally flat topography of the levels creates a situation where water accumulates and doesn't have anywhere to go quickly. The pumping stations that help manage water levels in this area are running, but they can only move water at a certain rate. And when you have the kind of rainfall inputs we're seeing with Storm Chandra, those pumping systems can be overwhelmed. For residents in the Somerset levels, particularly around areas like Langport, Musholney and Curry Rivell, be prepared for the possibility of flooding developing over the next 24 to 36 hours as water from upstream makes its way through the river system. Let's talk about the timeline going forward, because knowing when conditions are expected to improve is just as important as understanding the current threat. The heaviest rainfall associated with Storm Chandra is expected to continue through this afternoon and into tonight, with a gradual easing trend beginning late tonight into Thursday morning as the storm system moves eastward, and the most intense rainfall band shifts away from southwest England. However, and this is important, even as rainfall rates decrease, river levels will continue to rise for several hours after the rain stops, because it takes time for water to make its way through the catchment and into the main river channels. That means the highest flood risk for many rivers may actually occur Thursday morning, even though the heaviest rain will have moved through by that point. It's that lagged response that catches people off guard sometimes. So don't assume that just because the rain has stopped, that the flooding threat has passed. By Thursday afternoon, we're looking at conditions gradually improving across southwest England, with rainfall becoming lighter and more showery rather than the persistent heavy rain we're seeing right now. Friday is looking significantly better, with a brief ridge of high pressure bringing a window of drier, calmer weather to the region. Though I have to tell you that the extended forecast beyond Friday shows another weather system approaching from the Atlantic over the weekend. So this break in the wet weather is going to be relatively short-lived. The pattern we're in right now is characterised by a very active jet stream, bringing repeated low-pressure systems across the UK. And while Storm Chandra will move through, the broader pattern suggests continued unsettled weather through at least the first half of February. Now, let's address travel impacts, because Storm Chandra is already creating hazardous driving conditions across southwest England, and those conditions are going to persist through tonight. Surface water on roads is widespread, with numerous reports of standing water on major routes including sections of the A38, A30 and A361. The spray and reduced visibility from heavy rainfall makes driving particularly challenging, and we're seeing journey times significantly extended across the region as traffic slows to navigate the wet conditions. If you must travel today, please allow extra time, reduce your speed, maintain greater following distances than normal, and be extremely cautious around areas where water has accumulated on the roadway, because even water that doesn't look very deep can be enough to cause loss of vehicle control or damage to your engine if you attempt to drive through it at speed. There's a simple rule that emergency services emphasise repeatedly when it comes to floodwater on roads. Turn around, don't drown. Just 15 centimetres of flowing water is enough to knock an adult off their feet, and 30 centimetres of water, which doesn't even reach the door sills on most vehicles, is enough to float a car. You simply cannot judge the depth of floodwater by looking at it. You don't know if the road surface underneath has been damaged or washed away, and attempting to drive through floodwater puts you at genuine risk of becoming stranded in a rapidly worsening situation where rescue becomes necessary. Every year in the UK, people die because they attempt to drive through floodwater, and the message from emergency services is absolutely clear. If the road is flooded, find an alternate route regardless of how much inconvenience that causes, because the inconvenience of a detour is infinitely preferable to the danger of becoming trapped in a vehicle in floodwater. Rail services are also experiencing disruptions this morning, with speed restrictions in place on several lines across southwest England due to the weather conditions. Great Western Railway has issued alerts warning of possible delays and cancellations, particularly on routes serving Devon and Cornwall, and passengers are advised to check before travelling and allow extra time for journeys. The rail infrastructure is vulnerable to flooding at certain locations, and when water on the tracks reaches critical levels, services have to be suspended until conditions improve and safety inspections can be completed. It's frustrating when you're trying to get somewhere. But these precautions exist because running trains through flooded sections of track poses genuine safety risks to passengers and crew. For farmers and rural land managers across the region, Storm Chandra presents particular challenges with livestock management in wet conditions and concerns about soil erosion on sloping fields, where runoff is carrying topsoil away. If you have animals in low-lying fields that are vulnerable to flooding, taking action now to move them to higher ground is essential. Waiting until water is already rising means moving animals in stressful conditions where they're harder to manage. Checking on vulnerable livestock frequently through this weather event is important because conditions can deteriorate quite rapidly once water starts accumulating. Let's put Storm Chandra in some historical context, because understanding where this event sits in the spectrum of storms that impact southwest England helps calibrate the appropriate level of concern and response. This is not a record-breaking storm in terms of intensity or rainfall totals. We've certainly seen worse over the years. But it is a significant weather event that warrants the yellow warning that's in place and requires people to take sensible precautions. The yellow warning level indicates that the weather could cause some disruption and impacts to daily routines, and people should be aware of the potential for hazardous conditions. It's not the highest level of warning. That would be red, indicating dangerous weather with significant risk to life. But yellow definitely means this is weather that shouldn't be ignored or taken lightly. The January rainfall statistics for southwest England vary by location, but typically the region receives between 100 to 150 millimetres for the month depending on proximity to upland areas. Storm Chandra is delivering a substantial fraction of that monthly total in just 1 to 2 days, which compresses the hydrological response and increases flooding potential compared to the same amount of rainfall spread over a longer period. It's that concentration of precipitation in time that creates problems for drainage systems and river networks that can handle certain flow rates, but get overwhelmed when inputs exceed their capacity over sustained periods. Looking at the bigger picture pattern, Storm Chandra is the third named storm of this UK winter season, following Storm Bert in November and Storm Cornwall in December. The naming of storms by the Met Office and Met Arian serves an important public communication function. When a storm gets a name, it immediately signals that this is a weather system expected to have significant impacts and that people should pay attention to warnings and forecasts. Not every area of low pressure gets named, only those forecast to cause medium or high impact through wind, rain or snow. So when you hear a storm name, that's your cue that this is weather that requires awareness and possibly preparatory action. The weather forecast beyond Storm Chandra, as I mentioned earlier, shows continued unsettled conditions through early February, with the jet stream remaining active and additional weather systems likely to bring further rounds of wind and rain to the UK. That means the ground conditions are likely to remain saturated. River levels may stay elevated even during breaks in the rainfall. And the susceptibility to flooding remains higher than normal because there's no extended dry period forecast that would allow soils to drain down and river levels to return to normal seasonal baselines. This creates a cumulative effect where each successive rainfall event has greater flooding potential than it would in isolation. because the system hasn't had time to recover from the previous event. For the broader region, including areas just outside the yellow warning zone, you're still likely to see rainfall today and tonight, just not quite reaching the accumulation thresholds that triggered the warning. That doesn't mean you can completely ignore the weather. Any area of southwest England could see localised flooding if you happen to be under a particularly intense rainfall band. And the general advice about driving carefully in wet conditions and being aware of potential flooding applies across the entire region. Weather warning boundaries are somewhat artificial constructs based on where forecasters expect the most significant impacts. But weather doesn't respect those boundaries precisely, and conditions can vary over quite short distances depending on local topography and drainage characteristics. I want to touch on coastal impacts briefly because while Storm Chandra is primarily a rainfall and flooding event, there are also considerations for coastal areas with regards to wave action and spray. The onshore winds associated with this storm system are generating rough seas along the north coast of Devon and Cornwall, with large waves impacting exposed coastal areas. While we're not talking about the kind of extreme wave heights that would trigger coastal flooding warnings, the combination of high seas with elevated tide levels means that spray and wave overtopping could affect some exposed coastal roads and promenades. Coastal walkers need to exercise extreme caution and stay well back from cliffs and wave zones, because conditions can change rapidly and what looks safe one moment can become dangerous very quickly when a larger wave set comes through. As we move through the rest of Wednesday, keep monitoring official sources for updates because the situation with Storm Chandra could evolve if rainfall totals end up higher or lower than currently forecast, or if certain river catchments respond more quickly than anticipated. The Met Office provides regular forecast updates on their website, and through their app, the Environment Agency has real-time river level data and flooding information, and local authorities will issue specific guidance if flooding impacts require road closures or other public safety measures. Staying informed means checking these sources periodically rather than relying on a single forecast, because conditions can change and new warnings can be issued as the weather system evolves. The key message I want to leave you with regarding Storm Chandra is this. Take the warning seriously, take sensible precautions to protect yourself and your property, avoid unnecessary travel if possible, particularly during the overnight hours tonight when conditions will be at their worst. And absolutely do not attempt to drive through floodwater, regardless of how shallow it might appear. The vast majority of people will come through this storm without experiencing any direct impacts beyond wet and unpleasant weather. But for those in flood-prone areas, or those who make poor decisions about driving through water, this storm does pose genuine risks that need to be respected. For those of you who want to continue following the latest on Storm Chandra and weather conditions across the UK, please make sure you're subscribed to this channel and have notifications turned on, so you receive alerts when new forecast updates are posted. Weather events like this evolve over hours, and having access to current information is essential for making good decisions about travel, property protection, and personal safety. Hit that like button if you found this forecast helpful, and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what conditions you're experiencing. I always appreciate hearing from viewers across the country about what's actually happening on the ground in your local area. Stay safe out there, southwest England. Stay dry if you can manage it, and please exercise good judgment over the next 24 hours as Storm Chandra moves through our region. This storm will pass, drier weather is coming by Friday, and we'll get through this together. I'll be back with additional updates as conditions warrant, so keep checking back for the latest information. Until next time, take care everyone.